Alright, so we're now in the main menu. One thing that you need to have ticked for the A300 is start with the engines running. It's not actually going to start with the engines running because it uses the custom panel state folder and all those sort of things, but it will mean that the engine start runs correctly. It's a explainy codey thing that they're not very happy with each other. If you don't have this ticked, it won't actually light the engines off, so they won't start starting when you engage the fuel. It will wait till an arbitrary number and then start. The engines will still start, so don't worry if you don't have it ticked, but this is the setting that you should and really just tick it basically. It's going to make absolutely no difference to your flight other than it will work properly. And it's not going to load in with the engines running. Like I say, tick that box. It's on by default. If you turned it off, then turn it back on. So back to the engine start. So let's talk about what's going to happen. So let's turn it to B, and now we're presented with arm and arm. So that's saying that the starters are armed, ready to start, and if you now click either or of these buttons, it will change to a blue open, showing that the bleed valve for the engine is open, and it's going to put bleed air in there, and it's going to start spinning the engine round, and we can get ready to start it. So let's get a more drawn back view so we can see that. Alright, it's a teeny bit of an awkward view, but you can see almost everything here. So the engine page automatically displays itself because we've moved the engine mode selector to there. We can see that the engine indications are now, some of them are now showing because it's an old school FADEC, kind of a FADEC, but let's call it that. The FADEC has powered itself up on the engines for the A300. We can see our outside air temperature, 9 degrees on the EGT. It's actually the same as outside. They're not always the same. They do vary depending on the conditions, and all the other indications make sense. Bleed pressure, we've got some there coming on both sides because the fact that cross bleed is open. We're going to start engine number 2 first, which is the correct way of doing it. So it's 2 then 1, not 1 then 2. They change their mind after that, and most people do 1 then 2 now with modern Airbus family aircraft. But anyway, let's do it. So if I now lean up here and press open, you can see that the N2, so this value here, starts increasing. You can hear the engines are starting to spool up. Bleed pressure is starting to increase because it's getting more demand, so it's starting to do this. Vibrations have increased as well, and we're waiting for 20% N2 or max motor. It depends on the SOPs, but after 20% you can introduce the fuel. So I've just cut to a different view, so now we can introduce the fuel. We're just here paused for a microsecond because I want to explain what's going on. So I've introduced the fuel. So now what's going to happen is the engines are going to light off, as they're called. So basically the fuel that's gone into the engine is going to be ignited by the igniter, and woof, the engine's going to light up. It makes almost like a woof noise if you're outside the aircraft. It does actually do it on the GEs quite nicely because it happens quite quickly. On the PWs you can't really hear it. That's modelled on the exterior of the A300 as well. Go outside and take a listen to it on your next engine start. It's pretty cool. So now I want to mention one limitation of our system that we have, because we're being honest and open here about things that aren't quite like the real thing. Notice how we have no oil pressure here. This isn't 100% true. If the engine was turning at 20% N2, you should have a few psi of residual pressure just from the bleed spinning it up. Soon you'll see it come back up to the value. It's something we're looking at maybe down the line, but after you introduce the fuel, you will get a low oil pressure light. This is realistic, and for the Pratt & Whitneys, the engine start is way longer, and you actually end up with this oil pressure light for ages, and that's realistic. So all of this is realistic. It's just you would have a few PSI already before you introduce the fuel. So let's unpause and watch what happens. So you can see now, there you go, the PSI's jumped up, the oil pressure light's gone off at the correct point. EGT is increasing, so the exhaust gas temperature. N1, the big fan on the front, is starting to spin up. So next things that are going to happen is the starter is going to disengage. So this up here at starter 2, it will click off at about 42 or 46% N2. You'll hear it click, and then you'll see the light go out a few seconds afterwards, and you'll watch the bleed pressure drop. So there we go, it's clicked off, it's gone back to arm. Bleed pressure's dropped, and we're going to get a generator swap now. So there we go, you can see that it's swapped over. A lot of things happen very quickly there, so we're going to talk about them after the fact. Exhaust gas temperature coming back down, showing that we've got a good start, not a hot start. Fuel flow looks good, engine is stabilizing, looks good. Looks like we've got a good engine start. So the same for most engines when you're looking down to see if you've got it roughly 20 odd percent, roughly 400 degrees, roughly 60%, and fuel flow looks good as well. So we know we've got a good engine start. So let's talk about what happened in sort of quick succession there. So you heard so we pressed open, started spinning, put fuel in at about 20%, it lit off, oil pressure light comes on, low oil pressure light goes out. If it doesn't go out, shut the engine down. Obviously it should go out fairly quickly on the GEs. It lasts for ages on the PW till 70 psi actually is the value. And then we saw the start happen quite quickly. Once we reach 42-43% on the starter, it pops out. You hear the noise. It's quite an audible click as it returns. The open light changes back to arms because there's a few second delay. Bleed pressure down here dips because the valve's been opened, so the air can come around it, so it dips and then it comes back up again. That's realistic. They really do that. And then you get a generator transfer, and you heard the generators click and the screens flick off, and all the needles flick on here as well because they're attached to the correct electrical buses. So let's do it again for engine number 1. I'm not going to talk as much. I'm just going to let you watch what happened. And please do look at the electrical transfer though, because you actually get a slightly different message on the screens. Both sides are different. Obviously you're not going to see it on the right side anymore. Is basically because some of the flight control computers are momentarily unpowered, so they go and they throw an error message up on there, and the transfer is quite violent. So let's do it now. And I'm going to be quiet, remember. I just want you to monitor. I'm going to maybe say a few things like light off, low oil pressure, things like that. I also won't pause. I'll move my head down, put the fuel and put it back up. It's not the smoothest thing in the world, but we'll stick with it. Okay, I'm going to move my head down now. Ready. Introduce the fuel. You can hear it, light off. Lower pressure light out. Starter's the next thing that's going to disengage. Monitoring the exhaust gas temperature, it's not getting too high. Starter's disengaged. Arm light back. Shortly get the bus transfer. Okay, and EGT's coming down. Looks like we've got a good engine start with all the different parameters shown here on the engine page. So basically, that's how you do it. There's one more gotcha. I've done it. Lots of people have done it because I've seen people doing it. But don't feel bad because, like I say, I've done it multiple times. Now, what did we say this knob, it's not a button, it's a knob. What does this knob do? Well, it turns the packs off. So what happens if you forget to turn this to this setting here? Yeah, the packs don't come back on and you depressurize. So what will happen is on takeoff, the outflow valves will go, they'll close because they realize, I'm not getting much air here. And they will hold a residual value for quite a while, but eventually you will depressurize the aircraft. And I've seen multiple people say, my plane won't pressurize, why is it? And I say, can you take an overhead screenshot? And this is in this position. I'm like, you have no air conditioning, you have no packs, you have no air coming in. It's going to depressurize. And as soon as they put it back to, continuous or ignition, you can hear them come back on, and then the aircraft will start to pressurize itself again. So that is a big gotcha. Make sure you return it to off or whatever you want to return it to. So we can turn the APU off and we can turn the bleed off. Should have done it in the other order. That's fine. You can see the avail light is staying on. It doesn't shut itself down straight away because it has a cooling down period. It does it itself automatically. It won't. It's based on a few values. Other modern Airbus family aircraft, again, I know I keep saying it, do the same thing. So you don't have to time it or wait, just turn it off. It will shut itself down. If it shuts itself down straight away, it's because it wasn't hot enough and was pretty happy with where it was. It will just shut itself down. It won't thermally shock itself, which is a pretty cool system, really, that it does that, all the way back in 1982. So the engine has started. let's talk about a few other things now. Okay, so I've moved the head position back down now. The engines are started. You can see the wheel page is now showing automatically because it's automatically swapped from the engine page because the engines have started and the AP was off. It's like, I don't need that anymore, so it automatically displays the page that it thinks is the most relevant for the flight phase, which it would be because we're going to do, you know, flight control checks and all that sort of jazz, and we can see if the brakes are hot, blah 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 blah. So it displays that automatically, which is pretty cool. Same as modern family Airbus aircraft. Normally you'd start the engines at the end of the pushback, but I wanted to do it while we're on stand because, yeah, you know, otherwise it's a bit messy, I think is the best description. So we're going to push back now. I'm going to show you how to do that from the EFB, and then we're going to talk about taxiing behavior, and I think that's probably going to be it because this is probably really long. Again, like really really long, because I've spent ages talking about basically nothing all over again. But we're getting there. The engines are going. We're going to move under our own power today. Nice little quirky thing to show you now. See how the radial altimeters are not the same? Nice attention to detail, right? Just thought I'd point that out because they're not always the same, which is real. Sometimes they can display slightly different values. Anyway, let's talk about the EFB pushback. So we're back on the EFB. How would we get from here to, say, the pushback page? So we can go on drop down, ground ops, ground services. I'm going to see how I cannot disconnect the external and the chocks. That's because they're currently powering the aircraft. Obviously I should have disconnected them before, but I left it in here as a demonstration that if you can't disconnect them, that's because they are still connected and powering the aircraft. So if I now disconnect them, you can see the avail light comes on, the same light as the APU light, similar sort of thing. Now I can remove the external, now I can remove the chocks, so now we're good to go. Now let's click the pushback menu. So start, stop, connect, pre-plan. What does this mean? So let's start with pre-plan. So now it's going to take us into this overhead view automatically. So what I want to do is I'm going to push back. Well, let's actually do it like let's do it like this. And obviously this is the better pushback plugin made by Totorico, a fantastic plugin. Highly, highly, highly recommend it, and it's fully integrated with the A300. So I'm not going to tell you how to use better pushback, just it's pretty simple, it's very intuitive. So I've clicked where I want to go, I click enter. So when it says call me through the menu, that's what they mean by that is normally you would use the plugin menu up here to control better pushback. I believe you still can. I don't recommend it because it could actually cause conflicts between what we're telling it from the EFB and what we're telling it here. So the plan's been acknowledged. He's now going to come up to the aircraft and, you know, we're ready to go. So the plan's there. So what I can do is I can click start. So you put the plan in, you click start. Now the tug is going to come up and it's going to connect. There's the tug now. So as you can see, here comes the tug. The size of the tug actually depends on the weight and a few other factors of the aircraft. So you might, if you're very, very heavy, get the slightly bigger tug than this one, or you might also get this one, which I believe is the smaller tug. And you can see it's going to automatically connect itself up, lift the nose of the aircraft, and ready to push it back. But let's just watch it do that now. It's a like I say, it's a really, really good plugin. So one message that we would have missed is it's basically saying that he's ready to connect. He's going to connect the aircraft up right now.
So connected and bypass pin inserted. Release parking brake.
Okay, so he's told us that he's ready to go and we need to release the parking brake. So you can either click on the parking brake by just clicking on it, or I like to use the default command of V for Victor, which releases the parking brake.
Starting pushback.
And we can see that the parking brake released here because the pressure has dropped on this side. Also notice how the accumulator pressure recharged itself once we started the engines because the hydraulic system got the correct source. So while we're pushing back, let's talk about the taxiing characteristics of the aircraft and how it's custom in the A300 and what we did for that. Do it from a bit of a better view back here. So most, and I'm not saying all, but most airliners in X-Plane, if you release the parking brake, they will roll. You can test this, go ahead. I'm pretty sure there's others that I don't know of, and people are gonna furiously type this in the comments section, but anyway, I'm sure you'll let me know that if you release the parking brake, you will roll. And normally with an airliner, if you're quite heavy, it depends. I know it depends on the type, and I know it depends on lots of different factors, but we're generalizing here. If you release the parking brake when you're very heavy, it is not going to roll. It's going to need what Airbus call breakaway thrust. So you need a bit of thrust to get moving, and once it's moving, then it will roll at idle, because there's ground friction and whatnot holding it there. And then once it's rolling, it's like, oh, okay, now I can keep it rolling. It just needs what they call breakaway thrust. Now if you're light, it will roll at idle and won't need any breakaway thrust. This is the unique thing with the A300 that, well, I say unique, I'm sure there are other people that have done fantastic jobs of ground handling as well, but I'm just on about what we did in particular in a custom sense. So let's just pause this conversation for a second, because he's about to finish the pushback. You can see the menu on the left I still have up there. You can press stop at any time.
Complete. Set parking brake.
Okay, I'm going to set the parking brake with my magic V. You can hear it clicking into place.
Connecting toes. Stand by.
So he's automatically going to disconnect. You don't have to use the menu down here, really. The only one you need to use is pre-plan and start. You can tell him to connect, you can tell him to stop, blah, 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 through there if something happens. But ultimately, they're the commands that you need. So, back to what we were talking about. So, if you're light, the A300 will roll. If you're heavy, the A300 won't roll. Let's disconnect the hand signal on the other side. And we'll demonstrate that in a minute. And also, once you're above about 5 or 6 knots, the A300 should roll at idle at most times at all weights, unless you're very, very heavy. Did you hear that? That little boomph noise? It's kind of a cool thing. It's actually the sound of the tug disconnecting. We have a custom sound linked into Better Pushback for that. So it's quite a neat little thing.
Disconnected as bypass pin has been removed. Hand signal on the left. We'll see you next time and have a safe flight.
I feel like always saying goodbye and waving. It's not a real person, but anyway, it's habits, I guess. There we go. So he's disconnecting and he'll show us the pin. So let's look at that now. So I know the rough ballpark figures, because these figures are definitely not published. They're not the sort of thing you can go in FCOM and type in, when will the aircraft roll with the parking brake off? This is the sort of thing that you need to get from real people who fly the real aircraft, which is exactly where we got this information from. We're not making these numbers up. They are, we know these numbers are true. So let's take a look at our weight now. Alright, so what I've done, this is the easiest way. By the way, here's a little bit of a tip with airliners. If you're not sure if they're moving, don't look straight ahead. Look to your left. Obviously, if you're in the FO seat, look to your right. It's much, 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 much easier to assess movement via this, because you just watch it roll. So we're at 126.4 tons, which is pretty heavy. I don't expect the aircraft to roll. I can't remember the exact weights, so let's see. So I'm going to release the parking brake. And it's not rolling. I think we can all say it definitely isn't rolling. That's a pretty fair assumption. See how the pole, this bit here, is staying exactly where it is in the window, and I'm going to put the parking brake back on. No crazy jerky movements, okay? So let's lower the weight of the aircraft. Alright, so I've lowered the fuel from 16.8 to 5 tons, bringing our gross weight down to 115 tons. So it's less, but not insanely less, but it's less. It's enough. We were on the border, I think, before. So now let's release the parking brake and see what happens now. So parking brake off. And can you see we're just slightly starting to creep forward? I don't know if you can see that. We are moving at idle. I'm not touching the thrust levers, obviously. I'm just looking at the left side of the aircraft. You can hear they're at the same thing. And this will now creep until you get faster and faster and faster, and it will continue to accelerate and will taxi at idle. So again, let's go back to our other weight and show about the breakaway thrust. Alright, so a bit of a darker view. I've turned the lights up in the flight deck because the lighting is got a bit darker in here. It makes the flight deck not look quite as pretty, but that's fine. So remember we said before, if we release the parking brake, we're not going to roll. And now I'm not going to look at the left side. We can kind of see we're not rolling. So we need a bit of breakaway thrust. So if I increase the N1 a little bit, see how we're moving already? We just need a bit of thrust to get us going. So let's increase that a bit more. little bit more. 5, let's get up to about 5 or 6 knots. 3, 4, let's say about here, 5 or 6 knots. And now I'm going to come to idle and watch. It will now roll on its own. 7, still accelerating. Remember before it wouldn't move with the parking brake on, but now it will happily roll like this all the way out to your departure. And that's how a real airliner works. It's not fantastically simulated in a lot of add-ons because it's very difficult to get right. This was a lot of work to get this working right, but you can see we're still at 7 knots. So let's take a pause here for a second and talk a bit more about it. We're sat here paused. I'm sorry about the pausing and muting, and it's not quite as seamless as before, but once we get into these live flying segments, it's not as easy to pause and explain or to keep explaining while there's stuff going on because we're burning fuel, we're sitting here, things are moving, okay? So I need to pause the sim now to explain. I know it means the audio levels kind of go up and down a bit, but it's the way it's got to be, unfortunately. What I'm going to do now is explain another thing that's unique to the INI A300. And when I say unique, I mean we did our own thing. Other people may have done the same thing. So I shouldn't really use the word unique, but this is what we did for our product. Now, you may or may not have done this. If you've tried to taxi an airliner, and I'm not saying all of them, I want to say that clearly. If you tried to taxi an airliner in X-Plane and do a tight 360-degree turn onto, say, a remote stand or off a remote stand, it can be quite difficult. This is due to a few factors with the way that some people do taxiing and the way that some X-Plane used to set it up, etc., etc. But we have done a little bit of custom work to it, as you can see, with the thrust requirements and all that ground handling stuff. And what I'm going to do now, why I'm in this view here, is I'm going to go from where we are now on this line. I'm going to do a 360-degree turn, and I'm going to end up back on the line, okay? And I'm going to use not that much more than idle thrust. Now, if you've tried this in X-Plane, you're probably like, oh, that's quite difficult to do. So let's try it, okay? I'm going to have a mix of inside and outside views, but we're going to start with the outside view to show you. We may just stay on the whole outside view the whole time, and I can explain it, but let's see. So let's unpause. So we're sitting here. It's loud, obviously, because we're on the outside of the aircraft. And I'm going to release the parking brake now. So parking brake is released, and I'm going to increase the thrust a little bit. So you can see we're rolling, and now I'm going to go very hard left turn. So what's happening now, I'm using this is the maximum it can turn at. I think I can bring the power back almost all the way to idle. So let's start tracking the aircraft. Okay, this is a bit of a better shot. Excuse the jaggedy shadows. So you can see I've not touching the thrust now. It's pretty much at idle. I'm just holding full left. Notice how the nose wheel is not skidding. We're just turning, and we're turning at sort of the maximum rate that the aircraft can go at. And it's doing a pretty tight turn. You wouldn't think that a big wide body could turn like this, but I think we can actually almost come back to completely to idle. Maybe a tiny bit more power. We're probably at around 26% N1 now. Remember, if we were at the lower weight, we could obviously do this at idle. So here we go, coming back around. We'll just stay on this outside view. Coming back around, still no nose wheel skidding. We're coming back to get close to the line, and we're going to pop our head camera down there now to take a look. Alright, so here we are. It's a good view. So we can see, you might think, it doesn't look like it's going to get very much back on the line, but it will. I have faith. Let's keep going. It's a slow process. This is how slowly you'd want to turn a big, heavy aircraft like this on a turn like this. 2, 3, 4 knots at the most. Because there's a lot of tension, stress, and things going on the tyres like that. So here we go. Coming around. This is going to seem like people are not going to understand this. If you've tried to do this in other aircraft, you're like, oh yeah, I see why this is kind of impressive. If you've never tried to do it, you're like, I don't care. Like, so what? But anyway, it's something I think is worth showing off. So we're getting close to back on the line. And then we start to roll the nose wheel out. I just paused it because I want to explain this. Quite a few people are having problems taxiing the A300. Now, the way we did the system is realistic, but different to a lot of other aircraft. If you have a tiller, or I'm using my rudder pedals connected to the tiller in the yaw setting, which is actually, to be honest, pretty much the easiest way to taxi the aircraft. If you just let go of the... So now we're getting near the line. In a lot of aircraft, and I'm not saying just in X-Plane, but in P3D as well, you would just release the tiller turn angle or the amount of turn that you've got on the nose wheel. Now, what will happen in reality is the nose wheel, it will go, you want straight? I'll go straight. And it will immediately twist to straight. Then it will skid. Because basically it's going straight, and then the friction, there's too much turning force, and it will just skid. It will swing left and right. You have to, the same way that I gently turned in, you have to gently turn out. You have to do it both ways. This is exactly how you do it in a real aircraft. And it's something that we introduced here. Other aircraft have done it, but we introduced it quite aggressively here because it's what it's really like to taxi. And we've had multiple feedbacks from real A300 pilots, real people who fly heavies, you know, other people along those lines, that it felt like the most realistic aircraft they have ever taxied, period, in any simulator, because you have to be quite careful. Now, I might or might not show some display clips up here of how easy it is to skid the nose wheel on a real aircraft, especially the A300, because it doesn't tilt the nose wheel to the left and to the right like the 320, and it's much heavier, and it's a smaller nose wheel in terms of its compared to the overall size of the aircraft. It's very easy to skid the nose wheel of an aircraft, especially a big boy like this. So you need to be careful. 10 knots maximum in a turn, 30 knots maximum in a straight line, and if you've got a high speed, you need to be down at 30 or 40 knots when you do that. That's how they do it in reality, and that's how you must treat the A300. Going back to the beginning of the video, I don't want to come back to negativity. People often say, I want the aircraft to be as realistic as possible. We then make it as realistic as possible, and people say, I can't taxi the aeroplane. It's like, okay, we have to sometimes take a stance and say, this is how it works, and this is how we're going to try and introduce it. And just take it slowly, follow these sort of tips, and hopefully you'll have a nice taxi experience, because it's a bit different. I know it's annoying that it's different. I understand that, the frustration of it. And there are limitations, like in real life, you'll have a bit of feedback on the tiller, you'd have a lot more sensory input, so it's easier. So in the sim, it is more difficult. I'm not saying it's not. But this is how it works in reality. You must feed the tiller in, you must feed the tiller out into all turns. So let's try it now. So see, I'm going to slowly feed the tiller out like this, and now we're straight. And now I'm going to put the parking brake on. It's going to be a bit of a jump. We are virtually exactly where we began, and that shows you we did a 360 within our own turning span, whatever you want to call it, and that means that maneuvering this thing on tight positioning is pretty easy. It's pretty easy. There's no drama about it. So let's go back inside. Okay, right, let's just quickly show you what that looks like from the inside, but I'm not going to do the whole thing again because that took too long. So I've released the parking brake. Alright, increase the thrust a little bit. Now start the turn. Can you see how that kind of looks odd, like how tight we're turning? Because it doesn't often do that in airliners in the sim. Like, we are really turning basically just straight around, but this is what it feels like when you do it. Now, if I just immediately turn my nose to the right like this, can you see how it will actually change direction? It's not going to skid too much because we're at such a low speed. And I'm going to go back this way. You can see it's not, and can you see how it came to a stop there because of the direction turn was so violent? It was like, oh, it skid and it caught the friction. So now we're going to come to idle, and I'm going to slowly bring it to neutral, set the parking brake, bit of a nod, and let's talk about this turn that's coming up here. So I'm going to do it at a normal taxi speed, and we're going to look at it from and see what it feels like from the inside. And then I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to do it way too fast, and I'm going to reduce the tiller to neutral, and we're going to watch it skid. Okay, I don't know how well this is going to go, and I am aware, by the way, that there are no flaps, slats, flight controls, flows. I know this is not what this video is about. Okay, so we'll get to that eventually. So let's release the parking brake, bit of breakaway thrust. I can see it's moving. I'd obviously normally look to the left or to the right. Gently put it in, a little bit more thrust. Remember, I said 10 knots maximum in a 90-degree turn, okay? So we're at 5. And that's a maximum, not a target, okay? So 6 knots, I think that's more than enough for this turn. I'm going to slowly start to roll out like this. 8 knots now. It should just roll roughly idle. Probably will need a bit of power because of the amount of turning that we're doing. A little bit more. Let's get it up to about 8 or 9 knots. Alright, so 9 knots now. And now I'm going to slowly put the tiller in like this. Slowly. Just gently. And then I'm going to start rolling it out. Like that. Terrible taxiing. Awful. But anyway, you get the point. That was horrendous. I didn't go far enough back. I'm not used to big aeroplanes. Anyway, but you get the point. There was no skidding going on there. Now we could go up to 30 knots if we wanted in this turn. But in fact, why don't we do this? So let's increase the speed a little bit, and we'll take this next turn at an inappropriate speed because it's, you know, it's a bit more of a run up for it. So let's get up to, let's say 15 knots, 15, 20 knots. Oh, that is way too fast. You seriously, if you do a 90-degree turn at 15 knots in an airliner, it feels like you're getting thrown to the edge of your seat. Like it's not pleasant. And we're going to look at this from the outside. All right, so here we are on the outside view. It's kind of difficult for me because I don't exactly know what my ground speed is, but it's going to be around 16, 17 knots, something like that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the turn like this. See how it's skidded already? And I put it in, and then I'm just going to release it to neutral. I'm going to pause for a split second. So you can already see, look how the aircraft is leaning into the turn. It is not happy about this situation. I already have way too much speed for this turn because I'm virtually double what I should be. And now what I'm going to do is what most people do. Oh, my turn is finishing, and I'm just going to simply release the amount of turn that I have. This nose wheel is going to snap back to the middle, and the nose wheel is going to skid. Let's watch. So actually watch it from this angle, okay? Okay, let go. And you see it skid. You saw that it just dragged it around the corner, and this is still controllable. If you kept it in, it probably wouldn't have done as much. But now we're going to go in the grass. Okay? I think you're getting the idea. Gently in, gently out with the tiller, and you'll be fine. 10 knots in a turn, 30 knots in a straight line, slowly on the line-ups, and the system is realistic. This is how it works. If you have a very aft CFG, it can become a little bit exaggerated, but that again kind of comes down to a bit of X-Plane's ground friction modeling. So if you really, really don't like it, just load it with a forward CFG. You can do that from the menu at the top. Remember, I showed you way back, and it will put more weight on the nose wheel, which will make it taxi a bit stiffer, basically. But yeah, a little bit of a demo. I don't want to hang around on this. I think you get it. I don't want to go around all these corners at different speeds and, oh, look, it skids. Oh, no, it doesn't skid, but you get the idea.